With great pleasure, I'd like to introduce you all to an important mentor of mine, Dr. Sarah Summers. Dr. Summers is an associate professor of English in the departments of Humanities, Social Sciences, and the Arts at Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology, a renowned engineering and STEM university. Dr. Summers specializes in teaching and publishing about collaborative writing practices in global and professional contexts, as well as about writing practices across the disciplines. Her scholarship has been published in a range of writing center and writing pedagogy journals. We're lucky to have her with us today, and she'll share with us the unique pedagogical experiences that emerged when she ran a writing center in an engineering makerspace at Rose-Hulman. What happened in that makerspace stands to challenge what we all think we know about technical writing and about writing centers. The broader findings that surround today's talk are forthcoming in Writing Lab newsletter. Now, help me welcome Dr. Sarah Summers.
So Dr. Poole asked me to talk about what writing instruction and writing centers look like at a technical school. So I just want to spend really about 15 minutes sharing some context for that, and then we can open it up to all kinds of discussion. So first I'm going to tell you a little bit about Rose-Hulman, which is the school that I teach at. This is my 8th year here. So I'll talk a little bit about the technical writing center that I started here that's called the Com Lab, and then a very little bit about the makerspace writing piece that you may have read. So I teach mostly technical writing here at Rose-Hulman, which is, as Dr. Poole said, an undergraduate-focused STEM school in Terre Haute, Indiana, which is on the border of Indiana and Illinois. We have about 2,000 undergraduate students who are all pursuing STEM degrees. So you can't come here and major in philosophy or English or anything but science, engineering, or math. We have 2 required writing courses that are campus-wide, first-year writing and technical and professional communication. Most students take that at the end of their sophomore or junior year. And then so writing and 16 other disciplines are in my department, which is Humanities, Social Sciences, and the Arts. So it's different than what you would find at really most other schools. So our other departments are things like chemical engineering or biomedical engineering, and anything that might be considered not a STEM discipline is in my department. So in 2018, I decided that I wanted to get back a little bit more to my writing center roots. There's very little writing support for our students. We have a learning center on campus, but its focus is mostly on math and engineering tutoring. They do have writing tutors there, but they don't get a lot of training, and they primarily work with our international students. I don't think that's necessarily by design. I think that's just kind of default what happened, and so it's become that kind of space. And so there weren't places for our students to go when they needed help with writing, particularly writing outside of that kind of first year writing, general writing curriculum stuff. And most of our students are doing a lot of technical writing, particularly when they're going into their junior and senior year, doing design projects for clients. And there wasn't really a way for them to get support for that writing. So I wanted to design something that focused more on technical writing, but I also didn't want to step on the toes of the learning center. So I wanted to find a way to kind of make sure I wasn't competing with that space, which is why I started focusing on co-curricular writing. So specifically, I was looking at the writing that happens in our makerspace. And mostly, the students who use our makerspace are on competition teams. And so they're building things like concrete canoes and human-powered vehicles, and then competing against other college students. And as part of their competition scores, they have to complete things like design reports and PowerPoint presentations. And historically, they hadn't scored well in those areas. So you can see here, one team right before I started the Com Lab had scored in the bottom 20% for documentation in a competition that included high schools. And that was, yeah, it was pretty embarrassing. And I think it was a good selling point for me, right, that we could certainly do better than that. And it wasn't because of lack of ability. It was, I think, because of lack of support and lack of kind of a structure around that. So just some kind of nuts and bolts about the Comm Lab. I started it in 2018 as a pilot with a gift from a private foundation. So I train and hire about 4 tutors per year, and they each go through a quarter-long training with me. I select them myself, usually from students who I've had in one of my writing classes, and I'm really looking for somewhat writing aptitude, but I tend to pay a lot of attention to students who are asking me for a lot of feedback, using that feedback well, thinking a lot about what it means to get and ask for feedback on writing, right? Because they're the ones who are really engaged in the process, and those are the kind of people who I want in my writing center. They work about 2 hours a week doing sometimes individual tutoring, sometimes small group tutoring, so sometimes with those teams or design teams, and then some special events that I'll talk about later. As I started spending more time in the makerspace and getting into the makerspace literature, I realized that there was a lot of overlap between the goals and the learning approach in writing centers and the goals and learning approach in makerspaces. And if you read the article, you read a little bit more about this, but I'll just kind of give you a quick overview. So, for example, when we were approaching the makerspace about entering their space and about working with their teams, I sort of expected this resistance to the writing center model, like, what do other students know about writing that I don't, right? But actually, peer-to-peer learning is such an integral part of the way that people approach makerspace work. Like, that's how makerspaces work. They just look over at the person next to them and be like, oh, that's cool, will you show me that thing? That there wasn't that kind of ideological barrier to the work that we were doing. And all of these competition teams are very interdisciplinary. And so the idea that we had these tutors from a variety of disciplines coming in, there wasn't any resistance to that either. Still, we were outsiders and we wanted to know more about what the teams were doing. And so that's when we conducted a lot of interviews with students and faculty advisors. So our key findings, just kind of a high-level overview from that article. First of all, these teams are doing a lot of writing. Second of all, they are separating making and writing completely. But also, I think if we can find ways to show them the similarities between those things, we can really bring some of those maker attitudes into writing. So in terms of the writing that they were doing more writing than I expected, and I think way more communication and writing than they would have said initially without somebody prompting them in an interview to kind of write it all down. So they're working in a lot of genres, they're working with a lot of audiences, and they're doing it really without any guidance or feedback. So all of these teams have faculty advisors, but most of those advisors are sort of signing permission slips basically for them to go on trips. But it's impressive how much that they produce. This project is also coming at a time when, so the Higher Learning Commission, for example, which is an accreditation body, is really interested in looking more closely at the kinds of co-curricular work that students are doing. And so this project has sort of dovetailed nicely with some assessment work that we're doing. And I think it's worthwhile to spend time as writing instructors thinking about what students are doing in those spaces and how we can support and measure that, because I think that's becoming much more of interest, not just in accreditation conversations, but in conversations about transfer and sort of the praxis of writing, right, where students are actually getting to do some of these things. Let's see. Probably unsurprisingly, students were also, in the way that they were talking about writing, really separating it from making, right? Like, this was a completely separate task. It was something that they would basically tack on at the end. And this is partly why they were so unsuccessful, right? So the guy who ran the whole makerspace texted me a photo one weekend of students who were sitting in a tent at their competition, like 10 minutes before they were supposed to present, gluing 8.5 by 12 sheets of just like text, right, onto a poster board for their poster. Of course, they were not going to be successful, but also they're not engaging with the process and they're not learning what they're meant to be learning from doing that communication, right? If you're not documenting your design process the whole time that you're trying to create a design document, you're kind of missing out on what you're supposed to be documenting. And I love these quotes so much, and some of you might be dissertating right now, so like, writing is not the fun part, not very glamorous. Maybe you really feel that in your souls right now. My students certainly feel that. Let's see, and then so based on all of that information and all of these attitudes that students had, the thing that we really tried to tap into was the energy that students have for making and their respect for that as a process. So they don't see writing as a process. They see it as this kind of not fun end point that they have to achieve. But they are so willing to iterate and to plan and to take risks and to revise, right, when they're designing and when they're making. So the kind of overall goal of the Comm Lab is to help them see writing in that same way, or to see that writing can take on some of those same kind of tinkering, iterating, risk-taking things that they already like doing. So we've, in addition to traditional tutoring, some of the things that we have tried to do, we've done these sit down and write events where we invite teams to come in. Usually we bring food, and it's just a, write some goals up on the board of things that you want to achieve and sit down and write. And I think that it helps them see writing as a social activity, right? Not something that they have to do in isolation. It gives them some sense that, okay, this doesn't have to happen at the very end of this project. It can happen all along the project. And it gives our tutors a chance to kind of float around and see what they're working on. We've done a lot of project management workshops, and that kind of mind map slide is from one of those. Getting students to think about writing as an ongoing part of the project and kind of break it down. And so our makerspace teams had an orientation this fall, and we did a writing project management workshop for them, which is a little bit outside of the realm of maybe what you traditionally think about when you're thinking about writing center work, but it has been really productive for those teams to be able to lay out an entire, semester or quarter or year's worth of writing projects and think about how to break it down. And then to sort of support this last minute habit of students, but also get them thinking about how valuable feedback is. We have a campus-wide design fair in the spring called Rose Show, and we did these kind of blitz appointments for that show so that students could come in. It's like a 10-minute appointment. Bring your poster draft sometime in the 48 hours before you have to print it, and get some quick feedback from one of our tutors. And so it was kind of meeting students where they were in terms of their very last minute process, but also hoping to get them to see that feedback can be really valuable. And, if we'd done this 2 days before, even maybe we would have gotten some better feedback or could have made some more changes. And so those were also really successful. So that is really all that I wanted to talk about up front. So I would love it if we can have a kind of discussion and Q&A now.
So presumably, being at a primarily STEM institution, every writer who comes into the writing center there has some sort of background in STEM, and also probably in also using makerspaces. So I guess my question is, how do you think that consultants who don't have that background in STEM can prepare to do that kind of makerspace work, and maybe even speak some from personal experience in that?
Yeah, so I had actually, kind of prior to cooking up this Comm Lab plan, had not really spent much time in our makerspace. And as I was cooking up this Comm Lab plan, I decided to take a bunch of the free classes in our makerspace. So I made a birdhouse once. It was my first. I used one of those big saws that is attached to a table. I mean, I'm talking about this, obviously, I know nothing about this because I don't even know what this saw is called, right? Attached to a table, cut your fingers off kind of thing. To make a birdhouse, which seems like overkill, that wasn't necessary, but that's how we were doing it, right? And they have welding classes and screen printing classes, and here's how you organize a workspace safely classes, and all kinds of things. And so I think, if you're going to work a lot with STEM students, particularly if you're going to work a lot with students who are mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, civil engineers, those kinds of super hands-on disciplines, it's awesome to be able to go just take that risk kind of on your own and get comfortable with some of those things. I write about this a little bit in my article, but makerspaces can be really intimidating because, ours, you have to swipe your card to enter, you got to put on the safety glasses, you got to check your shoes. If you have long hair, you got to pull your hair back. It's like yellow caution tape inside, all kinds of noises and things that you haven't seen before. And so the students who gravitate to that space tend to be our students who grew up on farms, grew up building their own cars, grew up doing all of these kinds of things that made them comfortable in that space already. And so the more that you can do to break down those barriers for yourself, my students who are tutors, most of them had not been in the makerspace before. And so they were taking some of those classes and they were coming in there for the first time. And my students tend to look a little bit different than the students who are typically in our makerspace. And so we're helping, I think, bring different types of students into the makerspace too. And so, yeah, it feels, if that's not familiar for you, it feels a little bit risky or a little bit weird. I broke a drill bit when I was making my birdhouse. I was like, oh my gosh, this guy's gonna yell at me, but he didn't. It was like, it's all cool in the makerspace. It really is like a writing center-ish attitude, right? Like, you're gonna mess up. It's okay to try something. We're here to learn. This is a community, right? Like, a good makerspace is like a good writing center in that way. And so it's worth checking out.
So, yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. That was really interesting. And, I think what I'd be interested in hearing you talk a little more about, because one of the things we've got a large engineering school as part of the university here. And again, it's often a challenge when, particularly, say, when some of the graduate student writers who come in or are deep into their engineering projects, sort of thinking about how they are thinking about the role of their writing processes. And, obviously we're dealing with their drafts, but we also often, try to talk to them, engage with them about their writing process and make those kind of connections to the other kinds of work and processes that they're doing. But I'd be interested to hear a little more about sort of, within the maker space or even within some of these other group things, or just even individually, when you're talking with your tutors, what are some of the ways that you talk about, okay, here are ways in, here are strategies into the conversation or metaphors or any way you want to take the question?
Yeah, one of the things that we talk a lot about in the Comm Lab and try to use a lot are visual brainstorming tools. And so in engineering courses, a lot of times, particularly as students get further on in their courses and they're talking more about engineering management types of things, they're doing a lot of like fishbone diagrams and SWOT analysis and all of these things. You can Google brainstorming tools and you will find all of these things. But they're super familiar with that as a way to conceptualize and plan a project, like way more than, when I was working on my dissertation or when I work on a paper, it's just a text outline. It's very boring, right? And so we try to bring a lot of those visual brainstorming tools into our writing center sessions. So we always have a huge bag full of different size sticky notes and highlighters and all kinds of stuff, and really encouraging students to use physical space and visual tools to do things, because that's very familiar to the way that they're thinking about projects already. And so I think that just conceptually helps them integrate writing into their projects a little bit more, because it seems like the same type of process. And so we work on that a lot. Well, thank you all for coming. You are certainly welcome to email me anytime, particularly those of you who are on the job market, if you want to follow up about anything. But really, if you want to follow up about any of this, I'm very happy to hear from you.